The restaurant was still full when Reid left. That was the part Wren Calloway kept coming back to. Not the words. Not the way he had folded his napkin before he stood up as though the conversation had a correct ending and he wanted to find it, but the fact that the room was still full and the music was still playing and the candle between them was still burning and none of it had noticed. She sat with 2 glasses of wine, one hers and one his, both half empty, and she counted the words he had used to end 6 years. 48. She had counted twice to be certain. 48 words to say that she was kind and she was good and she was the kind of woman a man was grateful to have known, but that she did not have the fire he needed, the ambition, the hunger for more, the particular quality of wanting that would push both of them toward the life he was building. She did not have it, he said, and he needed it, and he hoped she understood that this was not about her but about the fit, and the fit was wrong, and he was sorry. 48 words. She had been with him for 6 years, and he had used 48 words, and none of them was a lie she could identify, which was the part that made it hard to breathe. She did not cry. She had the specific sensation of being about to cry and then not crying, like a wave that comes to shore and pulls back without breaking. And she sat in that sensation for a while and looked at the candle and thought about the word ordinary. He had not used it. Exactly. He had said fire and ambition and hunger and fit. But underneath all of them was the shape of ordinary, the implication of it, the way you could hear a word in the space around the words that were actually spoken. She had heard it clearly. She had been hearing it. She understood now, for longer than tonight. In the pauses, when he talked about colleagues who had just made partner. In the weight of his silence, when she talked about a manuscript she loved. In the particular quality of his attention, when she was being someone he found impressive versus someone he found familiar. She had been measuring herself against ordinary for a long time, and had never said so. And tonight, he had said it for her in 48 words that were not that word. And the honest thing she had to admit to herself, sitting alone in a restaurant still full of other people's evenings, was that she had not argued. She had sat with her hands in her lap and listened and not argued. Because somewhere underneath the 6 years she had not been sure he was wrong. Her phone rang at 8:43. The number was not in her contacts. She looked at it for a moment with the disengaged attention of someone who had already used up most of her available focus and was running on the remainder. And then she answered. Because answering was easier than deciding not to. The voice on the other end was one she recognized without being able to immediately place it. The way you recognize a piece of music before you remember its name. Low and unhurried, and with a quality of certainty that she had not heard directed at her in a very long time. Wren. The voice said, not a question, as though her name was something the voice had always known how to say, and was simply saying it again. It's Callum. She did not say anything for a moment. The candle between the 2 wine glasses flickered once. Callum Vane. 10 years of nothing. And then her name in a voice that had not changed enough for her to have any reason to be surprised it was still his. I'm outside, he said. If you want to go. She looked around the restaurant. At the other tables. At the door where Reid had walked out 20 minutes ago. At the half-empty glass of wine that she had been intending to finish and had not touched since the moment she started counting words. She did not ask how he knew where she was. She did not ask how he had her number. She picked up her bag and put $20 under the base of the candle because the waiter had been attentive and none of this was his fault. And she walked out. He was standing beside a black car at the curb. And he had changed in 10 years in the ways that time changes people who have been doing difficult things with it broader, more settled in his own dimensions. The particular quality of stillness that comes from having made a great number of decisions and learned to live with the ones that did not go the way you intended. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, which was directly and without the performance of looking. And she stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and looked back at him and felt, underneath the wreckage of the evening, something that had nothing to do with Reid Ashworth, and everything to do with the 10 years she had not thought to count. "You look the same," he said. "You're lying," she answered, and he almost smiled. And the almost was so familiar she had to look away. In the car, he did not ask what happened. This registered as the first unusual thing, because everyone who had ever witnessed her in a difficult situation had asked what happened, had wanted the story, the sequence, the explanation they could use to place themselves correctly in relation to her pain. Callum drove and said nothing and let the city go by outside the windows, and Wren sat in the passenger seat and felt, for the first time since 8:23, when Reid folded his napkin, that she did not need to manage the air in the room. They were 20 minutes from her apartment, on the expressway with the Chicago skyline behind them and the suburbs assembling themselves ahead, when he said, without looking away from the road, "I want to ask you something. You can say no." She turned to look at him. The dashboard light was low, and the city was behind them, and he was watching the road with the attention of someone who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it correctly. "Marry me," he said. Not a question, technically, but he had offered her the no before he said it, which meant it was a question in every way that mattered. She stared at him for a long moment. He did not look at her, which she understood was not avoidance, but the specific courtesy of giving her space to have a reaction without an audience. "Callum," she said. "Yes," he replied, meaning he had heard her, not meaning he was answering something she had asked. She looked at the road ahead. She thought about 48 words. She thought about 6 years of measuring herself against a version of herself she had not been able to locate. She thought about the fact that he had not asked what happened tonight, had not asked how she was, had not offered condolence or explanation, had only offered the one thing that was entirely forward-facing and entirely up to her. She thought about the 10 years in which his voice had been absent from every room she occupied, and how thoroughly she had not noticed until the moment she heard it again on the phone in a restaurant where the candle was still burning. She thought, "I do not know what this is. I do not know what he means by it, and I do not know what I mean by saying yes." And then she thought, "I have spent 6 years knowing exactly what everything meant and being wrong about it anyway. Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The quiet of someone finding the right entry point to something large. "Because I want to," he said at last. She waited for more. More did not come. She turned back to the window and watched the city thin into distance, and thought about the fact that in 48 words, Reid had given her every reason, and none of them had felt like the truth. And in 4 words, Callum had given her no reason at all, and she had felt, obscurely and without being able to justify it, that she was being told something real. She did not understand this. She was a person who believed in language, who had spent her professional life in the precise architecture of what words meant and how they worked. And here she was in a car in November, being proposed to by a man she had not spoken to in a decade, who would not explain himself. And she was considering it. She was more than considering it. She was looking at the exit for her apartment and feeling, for the first time in the evening, that she did not want to arrive. "Okay," she said. He glanced at her then, just briefly. "The way you look at something you want to confirm is real before you allow yourself to believe it." "Okay," she said again, more clearly, because she had decided and she was not going to soften it into something uncertain. He looked back at the road. His hands did not move on the wheel, but something in the set of his shoulders changed. A small adjustment. The letting go of something that had been held for a very long time. And Wren saw it and filed it alongside all the other things she did not yet have words for. Outside, Chicago went dark in the rearview mirror, and she sat in the passenger seat of a car belonging to a man she had once known completely and now did not know at all. And she had just agreed to marry him. And the strangest part, the part she would think about for a long time afterward, was that it was the first decision she had made all evening that did not feel like losing. They were married on a Thursday, 7 days after the restaurant. At the Cook County Clerk's office on Daly Plaza, with two witnesses who were Callum's and whose names Wren did not catch because one of them had a cold, and the other introduced himself too quietly in a lobby that echoed. It took 11 minutes. Wren wore a grey dress she owned already, and Callum wore a dark suit, and they signed the certificate, and he held the door for her on the way out. And the whole thing had the quality of a business transaction conducted by two people who understood the business and were not insulted by the efficiency of it. In the elevator going down, she looked at the ring on her left hand. Plain and gold, and exactly the width of something chosen rather than assumed. And she thought, I've been engaged twice in my life, and this is the only ring that felt like a question answered rather than a question asked. The apartment he lived in was on the 42nd floor of a building in the West Loop that had the particular quality of spaces designed by someone who understood silence as an architectural element. High ceilings, pale stone, windows that occupied entire walls and let in light that fell at angles that changed through the day in ways she found herself noticing. She had a room with a separate entrance from the main bedroom, which he had shown her without comment. The way you show someone a room when you want them to know they have space without making the offer into a negotiation. She had put her books on the shelf in the hallway, the 3 she had brought from her apartment, and he had not said anything about them except to note, the following morning, that there was more shelf space in the study if she needed it. She went to look. There was enough for considerably more than 3 books, empty and waiting. And she stood in the study doorway for a long moment before she went back to what she had been doing, because the shelf space was either a courtesy or a statement, and she had not yet decided which, and either way she needed more information before she responded to it. The information started arriving on the 3rd day. In the accumulation of small things she would have dismissed individually but could not dismiss together. The coffee was the first one she registered consciously. She would come into the kitchen at 7 in the morning to find a cup already poured. The right cup, the particular flat white she had been making herself for 4 years, with the specific ratio of espresso to milk that she had spent approximately 3 months calibrating before she got it right. She stood in front of it and picked it up and drank half of it before she said, to Callum, who was at the kitchen table with his phone, "How did you know how I take this?" He looked up. I asked Daniel. He said, which was the name of her regular barista at the coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment. She held the cup. She thought about the logistics of asking Daniel something like that, which would require knowing she went there, which would require knowing where she lived, or where she worked, or both. She finished the coffee and did not ask the follow-up question yet, because she was not ready to have the conversation she would need to have if the follow-up question led where she thought it was going. The book was the second thing, and it was less deniable. She found it on the evening of the 5th day, running her finger along the shelf in the study because she had decided to take him up on the offer of space and was identifying a section for her own titles. It was a novel she had edited 3 years ago, a debut by a writer she had believed in before anyone else had. A book that had not sold many copies and was not widely known. Her name was not in it, because she was a line editor, and line editors did not appear in acknowledgements unless the author thought to put them there. And this particular author had been young and overwhelmed and had not thought to put anyone there. There was no reason for this book to be on Callum Vane's shelf. There was no algorithm that led to it. No bestseller list. No review that would have surfaced it to someone with no connection to the publishing industry. She pulled it out and turned it over and read the back and put it back exactly where it had been. And she went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window looking at the city and thought, this is the 3rd thing I cannot explain. And I have not yet asked him a single direct question. And I need to decide whether I am not asking because I am not ready for the answer, or because I do not want to give him the opportunity to lie before I know enough to recognize the lie. On the 6th day, Reid called. She was in the study reading a submission when the phone rang, and she looked at his name on the screen and felt the specific flatness of someone looking at a word they have read too many times for it to carry any particular meaning. She answered because not answering would have made her feel like she was managing something, and she did not want to manage things that did not require management. He wanted to know if she was all right. She told him she was. He said he had heard she was seeing someone. The particular construction of someone who had heard a specific name and wanted her to volunteer it. She said she was married. The silence on his end had a texture to it. "Wren," he said. "Callum Vane," she replied, because she was not going to make him work for information she was willing to give him. The silence changed. "You need to be careful," he said, with the gravity of someone delivering a warning they believe to be genuine. And underneath the warning she heard something else. The particular pitch of a man who had made a calculation about his own feelings and arrived at a conclusion he was not entirely comfortable with. "I'm always careful," she told him, and ended the call, and sat for a moment with the phone in her lap and thought about the warning and what it was actually made of and whether there was any part to it that was about her, rather than about Reid's revised understanding of his own loss. That evening, Callum's name appeared in 3 separate news alerts on her phone, which she had not set up and had not sought out, but which arrived because she had searched his name twice in the past week, and the algorithm had drawn its conclusions. She read them. They were not alarming in the way Reid had implied. They were the standard coverage of a man who ran a significant private organization with reach into logistics, real estate, and several categories of influence that the articles described carefully without naming directly. She had lived in Chicago long enough to understand the grammar of that kind of coverage. She had read enough books to understand narrative economy. She put her phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought, "I married a man I have not spoken to in 10 years. Who knows how I take my coffee? Who has a book on his shelf that no one should own? Who the news covers in a particular careful way? And I have not asked him a single direct question in 6 days." She thought about why. The answer arrived without ceremony. A quiet, factual thing. She was a person who trusted language, and Callum was a person who did not use it. And she was afraid that if she asked him the questions she needed to ask, the answers would be in the language she could not read, and she would have to decide whether to believe something she could not verify in words. She went to find him. He was in the living room with a document he set aside when she came in. The unhurried movement of someone who had been waiting for something to arrive without knowing when it would. She sat down across from him and said, "Someone changed my room number at that restaurant. The reservation was under my name, but they moved me to a different table, the one by the window, which is where you would have been able to see me from the street." She watched his face. Nothing changed on it. "I need to know," she said, "whether you arranged to know where I was that night, or whether it was something else." He looked at her for a long moment with the direct attention she was beginning to understand was not evasion, but the specific honesty of someone who was deciding how much truth to give, rather than whether to give any. "I knew where you were," he said. "I did not arrange the table." She held his gaze. "But you knew." He said yes. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the coffee and the book and the shelf with space for more than 3 books. "How long have you known things like that?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, and it was the longest he had been quiet since she met him again at the curb outside the restaurant. And in that quiet she heard the shape of an answer that was going to be larger than she was ready for. "A while," he said at last. She nodded once. The specific nod of someone who has just confirmed the location of a door they are not yet ready to open. She stood up. "Okay," she said, not as permission and not as acceptance, only as the acknowledgement that she had heard him and was going to need to think about what she had heard. She went back to the study. She did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, but from the particular wakefulness of a person standing at the edge of a story she had been living in without knowing it, trying to see back to the beginning. It was raining on the 9th night. The particular November rain that came in sideways off Lake Michigan and made the city sound like it was thinking. Wren was on the couch with a manuscript she was not reading, the pages in her lap and her eyes on the window where the rain was doing its sideways thing against the glass. When Callum came in from wherever he had been and set 2 mugs on the coffee table and sat down at the other end of the couch, she looked at the mugs. Tea. both of them. And not the tea she would have chosen, but the one she would have chosen on a night like this, which was different. The one she made when the weather required something heavier than her usual preference. She picked it up and said nothing, because she had run out of ways to register these small, accurate things without making the registering into a conversation she was not yet ready to have all the way through. They sat in the rain sound for a while. She was not reading the manuscript and he was not doing anything visible, which she had come to understand was not restlessness but the specific quality of a person comfortable in silence who was also paying attention to everything in the room. It was Callum who spoke first, which surprised her because in 9 days she had formed the impression that he rarely initiated, that he answered and he offered and he provided, but that he did not. As a rule. "Begin. Can I ask you something?" he said, not looking at her, looking at the window where the rain was. She looked at the side of his face. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Finding the shape of it. What was it like? The 6 years. She thought about that for a moment. Not because the question was difficult, but because it was the first question anyone had asked her about those 6 years that was not about what went wrong at the end. And she needed a moment to understand that that was what was different about it. She set the manuscript on the table. She put both hands around the mug. "Good for a long time," she told him. "Then complicated. Then something I was managing instead of living." She paused. "I think I confused being reliable for someone with being loved. They overlapped for long enough that I stopped checking whether they were still the same thing." Outside, the rain shifted direction and hit the window at a new angle. A brief intensification of sound, and then settled back. Callum was quiet for a moment. Did he know? He said. She thought about it honestly. "I think he knew he needed me." She answered. "I don't think he knew the difference either." He nodded, and the nod was not judgment, was not sympathy performed for her benefit, was the acknowledgement of a person who had heard something true and was holding it carefully. She looked at him for a moment. At the profile she had known since she was 19, and that had accumulated 10 years of weather she had not been present for. And she asked what she had been building toward since she sat down with the tea. "Your turn," she said. He looked at her then. "The 10 years," she said. He looked back at the window. She waited, because she had learned in 9 days that waiting with Callum was different from waiting with other people, was not a test of patience, but a form of respect, giving the words room to arrive at the right size. "I built something," he said at last, which was both completely true and almost entirely insufficient as a summary of a decade. "Yes," she said. He looked at his mug. "When I left Chicago, I had a specific number in mind, an amount, a kind of weight. I thought if I could reach it, I would have the standing to do certain things I didn't have standing to do before." He paused. "It took longer than I thought it would. Things always take longer." Wren looked at him. "What things?" she asked. He met her eyes and held them for a moment with the direct quality that still, 9 days in, had the capacity to make her feel like the room had shifted slightly on its axis. "To come back," he said simply. She sat with that. She thought about the word back, which implied a direction, which implied a destination, which implied he had been going somewhere specific for 10 years, and the destination had a name. She did not ask the name yet. She looked at her tea and thought, he is telling me something in the language he uses, which is not made of sentences, and I am becoming, slowly, and against my better judgment, literate in it. It was later, when he had gotten up to refill the mugs and come back, that she said, "I need to ask you something about the book." He settled back at his end of the couch. He did not ask which book. That told her something too. "The Marin novel," she said, using the author's last name, because it was how she thought of the books she edited, by the people who wrote them, not the titles. "It was on your shelf. I edited it. There is no version of that book being on your shelf that I can explain without assuming you already knew about my work before we met again." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze. "How long have you been following my work?" she asked. He was quiet. "Following is the wrong word," he said at last. "I know what you've worked on. I've read most of it. I started because I wanted to understand what you spent your time believing in. And I continued because the things you chose to work on were worth reading." The sentence landed simply, without decoration, in the way he said all things. And she sat with it for a moment and felt something move in her chest that was not quite comfortable and not quite unwelcome. The specific sensation of being seen in a capacity that mattered to her by someone whose opinion she had not planned to care about and found she did. She looked at the rain against the window. She thought about manuscripts she had championed for reasons she could not always articulate even to herself. The particular quality of believing in something before it existed in its final form. And she thought about what it meant that someone had followed that thread for years in her direction. "That's a strange thing to do," she said, not as accusation. "Yes," he agreed. "I know." She was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough for the rain to change again and the room to settle into a different quality of silence. The kind that has been occupied long enough to belong to the people in it. She thought about what she knew and what she did not know, and the distance between those two things, which was still considerable, but was smaller than it had been 9 days ago, and smaller than it had been an hour ago. She thought about what Callum had said about coming back, and about what back meant, and about the fact that she had been the person he left behind when he left, which she had never registered as a loss at the time because she had not known she was losing anything. And there was something quietly devastating about that. About the 10 years in which she had been living her life, and someone had been building toward it from a direction she could not see. She set her mug down. She looked at him. At the side of his face in the rainlight, she said, "I think I need you to tell me something that isn't a piece of the answer. I think I need one whole thing." He turned to look at her. The room was very quiet. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw it happen. The thing she had been watching for without knowing she was watching for it. The shift in him that was not composure failing but something being voluntarily set down. He said, "I left because I could not stay and watch you choose someone else. And I came back because 10 years was the longest I was willing to go without telling you that." He said it in the same voice he used for everything. Level and unhurried. And the steadiness of it made it land harder, not softer. The way a thing lands when it has been true for a very long time and does not need to be performed. Wren sat with it. She felt her hands tighten slightly around the mug she was no longer holding and then release, because her hands had not gotten the message that she had set it down. She looked at the window. She looked at the rain. She looked at him. And he was looking at her with the expression she had been watching assemble itself across 9 days of shared silence. And it was not hope exactly. Was something older and more weathered than hope. The expression of someone who has said the true thing and is now simply present for whatever comes next. She did not answer immediately, because the answer was not simple, and she was not going to make it simple to spare either of them the weight of it. Instead, she stood up and went to the shelf in the study and came back with the Merrin novel and set it on the coffee table between them. "Cover up." She sat back down. She looked at it for a moment, and then at him. "This book ends without resolution," she told him. "The author fought me on it for 3 months. She wanted to give the characters an answer. I kept telling her that the most honest thing she could do was trust the reader to live with the uncertainty, because that was what the characters would actually have to do." She paused. "She called me 6 months after publication to say I was right. It took her that long to believe it." She looked at Callum. "I think I need some time," she said. "Not to decide. I think I already decided, but to believe it." He nodded. And the nod was the same as always. The one that meant he had heard her and was not going to argue with anything she had just said. She reached over and picked the novel up off the table and held it in her lap. And outside, the rain was still doing its sideways November thing against the glass. And the room was warm and quiet and entirely changed from the room it had been at the beginning of the evening, and she sat in it and let herself feel the full weight of a story she was only now beginning to understand she had been in the middle of all along. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the restaurant. While Wren was in the study with a red pen and a manuscript, she was genuinely reading this time, the kind of reading that required her full attention because the prose was doing something she had not seen before, and she wanted to understand the mechanism. It was her contact at a literary agency, a woman named Clara, who had been in the industry long enough to know the difference between gossip and information, and who dealt only in the second kind. Clara had heard Wren had married. She had heard the name. She wanted to know, not unkindly, whether Wren understood the full scope of what the name meant. Wren said she was learning. Clara said there was a man, a logistics contractor named Ferris, who had been making inquiries about Callum Vane's personal connections for the past 3 weeks. The kind of inquiries that involved calling people who worked adjacent to those connections and asking questions that sounded like background checks and were not. He had called Clara's assistant. He had asked about Wren specifically. Clara thought Wren should know. Wren thanked her, ended the call, and sat for a moment with the red pen still in her hand. Looking at the manuscript, she was no longer reading. She spent the afternoon thinking rather than working, which was unusual for her because thinking and working were usually the same activity, her best thinking happening inside a task rather than around it. She thought about the news articles she had read the week before. She thought about the grammar of that coverage, the careful language, the categories of influence described without being named. She thought about Callum's answer when she had asked, "How long?" which was a while, which was not a number. She thought about the fact that she had been married for 11 days and had asked him many things and had not yet asked him the most direct version of the central question, the one that Clara's call had now made it impossible to continue not asking. She thought about why she had not asked it, and the answer she arrived at was not flattering to herself. She had not asked because she did not want the answer to change anything, and she had understood, without articulating it, that the answer might. That was not good enough. She had spent 6 years not asking questions she was afraid of, and she was not going to spend the next period of her life repeating the same habit with higher stakes. She found him in his office at the end of the hall, a room she had not been in before, which was not because it was prohibited, but because she had been extending him the same privacy he extended her. He was on a call, but he ended it when she came in, without apology to whoever was on the other end, and she registered that and set it aside. She closed the door. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, which was clean in the way of people who kept their work in their heads rather than on surfaces, and she looked at him and said, "Someone named Ferris has been making inquiries about me. He called people I work with. I need to know if that's connected to you, and I need to know what kind of work you actually do, and I need the direct version of the answer, not the version you think I can manage." He looked at her across the desk. He did not look surprised, which was either because he had expected this conversation or because he did not look surprised at things as a general rule, and she still could not reliably tell the difference. He said, "Ferris works for a man named Creel. Creel has interests that conflict with mine. He has been aware of you since the marriage became public record, which it did the day we filed." He paused. "The kind of work I do involves acquiring and managing influence across several industries. Some of what I manage operates outside what you would consider conventional frameworks. Creel operates in the same space and considers me a competitor." He stopped. She waited. He said, "The inquiries about you are his way of communicating that he is paying attention. It is not a threat yet. It is a signal." She looked at him for a long moment. "And you did not tell me," she said. It was not a question. He held her gaze. "No," he said. She nodded once. "Is there anything else you have not told me that falls in the category of things I should know because they affect my safety or my ability to make informed decisions about being in this marriage?" The silence that followed was several seconds long, and she counted them, and the counting told her something. "Yes," he said at last. She set her hands flat on her knees. The same grounding gesture she had used in difficult editorial meetings when the conversation required her to stay present rather than react. "Then tell me," she said. "All of it." He told her about Creel. He told her about the structure of the organization he ran, the layers of it, the legitimate and the less legitimate in their correct proportions. He told her these things in the same level voice he used for everything, which she now understood was not dispassion but the trained delivery of someone who had learned that the manner of a truth was as important as the truth itself. When the truth was large, she listened without interrupting, because interrupting would have allowed her to insert her own responses before she had heard everything, and she needed to hear everything before she responded to any of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She thought about Clara. She thought about the manuscript in the study with the red pen laid across it. She thought about 11 days of a marriage she had walked into with the specific recklessness of someone who had decided that not knowing was no longer a condition she was willing to maintain. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again. "Now I need to ask you about 10 years ago." He was very still. She had seen him still before, had come to understand that stillness was his natural state. But this was different, a different quality of stillness, the kind that comes before something rather than in the absence of something. "There was a night," she said, "before you left. I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks. Since the car, since the expressway, since you said the word back. You left in November. I remember because the radiator in my apartment had broken and I kept having to wear my coat inside. And I remember thinking when I heard you had left that I should have asked you to help me call the landlord one more time because you were better at that than I was." She stopped. She looked at him. "I have been thinking about whether there was a moment before you left, when something was about to happen that didn't happen, and I need you to tell me if I'm remembering something real or constructing it." He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she had last seen on the couch in the rain light, the thing being voluntarily set down. Then he said, "There was a night. I came to your apartment. I stood outside your door." He stopped. She waited with everything she had. "I could hear you on the phone," he said. "You were laughing. You were talking to someone and you were laughing in a way I had not heard you laugh before, and I understood what it meant. And I left." He said it plainly, without drama, without the cushion of additional words around it, and it landed in her chest with the specific weight of something that had been falling for a very long time and had finally reached the floor. She sat with it. She sat with the image of him outside her door and herself on the phone and the particular obliviousness of a person who does not know they are being heard. She sat with the 10 years on the other side of that door, what she had done with them and what he had done with them, and the radical difference in how each of them had spent the same amount of time. She sat with the anger, which arrived not loudly but with complete authority. The anger of someone who has just learned that a decision was made for them in a hallway they were not in. "You decided," she said. Her voice was level. "You were outside my door, and you decided, and you left, and you did not tell me. For 10 years, he held her gaze. "Yes," he said. She stood up. She was not storming, not performing. She was simply upright and needed to be moving. The way the body sometimes requires a change of position when the mind is processing something that is too large to sit inside. She crossed to the window of his office, which looked out over the city, the same as all the other windows in the apartment looked out over the city. And she stood there with her back to him and looked at the buildings and the sky and the specific quality of afternoon light on glass. She thought about Reid's 48 words, which had told her something she had not been able to argue with because she had believed it. She thought about Callum's one decision, outside her door, which had cost them both something they could not calculate because they had never been able to see the whole shape of it. She thought about the difference between a man who said too much and a man who said nothing, and how she had managed to spend 6 years with one and marry the other without understanding until this moment that her entire life had been organized around the question of whether she was legible to the people who were supposed to see her. She turned around. He was exactly where she had left him, which was the only thing she had expected. "I need to not be in this room right now," she told him. He nodded. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame and stopped. Not because she had more to say, but because she needed him to hear one thing before she left the room. "You should have knocked," she said. She went out and closed the door quietly behind her, because the quiet was the point. And she walked to the study and sat down and picked up the red pen and held it in her hand for a long time without touching the manuscript, feeling the full weight of a sentence she could not yet finish, which was if he had knocked, and if she had opened the door, and if she had heard what he came to say. She did not know what she would have done, and not knowing was the thing that was going to take the longest to live with. She stayed in the study for a long time, long enough for the afternoon light to move across the floor and reach the opposite wall and begin to thin, long enough for the red pen to leave a small mark on the back of her hand where she had been holding it without noticing, long enough to read the same paragraph of the manuscript 4 times without retaining a single sentence, which was a thing that had never happened to her in 14 years of professional reading. And the fact that it was happening now told her something about the size of what she was sitting inside. She was not avoiding the conversation. She was not afraid of it. She was doing something she had always done with large things, which was to let them settle into their actual dimensions before she responded to them, because her first responses were not always her most accurate ones, and she had learned this about herself early enough to build her entire career on the discipline of waiting to know what she actually thought before she said it. What she actually thought arrived in pieces, the way things do when they are too composed to come all at once. The first piece was the anger, which she had already felt, and which she sat with again and found on second examination to be something more complicated than anger, a grief underneath it. The specific grief of a door that had been standing for 10 years between 2 people who both had their hand on the knob and neither of them had turned it. She had not turned it either. She had been inside her apartment, on the phone, laughing at something she did not now remember, while 10 years were being decided in her hallway. That was the part that was hardest to sit with. Not what Callum had done, but what neither of them had done. The mutual failure of 2 people who trusted their own reading of a situation and trusted it wrong. The second piece was a question she had been circling without naming if he had knocked, and she had opened the door, and he had told her what he had come to tell her. What would she have said? She examined this honestly, the way she examined prose she was trying to understand, looking at the structure underneath the surface. She had been 23. She had been standing in her kitchen in her coat because the radiator was broken, and she had just gotten off the phone with a man she barely knew who had made her laugh in a way that felt new, and she had not yet understood whether new was the same as right. She had been someone who did not know yet how to tell the difference between being wanted and being seen. She was not sure she would have been ready for Callum Vane at the door with the truth in his hands. She was not sure she would have known what to do with it. That was the second piece, and it sat alongside the first, and together they made something that was not simple enough to be called a conclusion, but was honest enough to be the beginning of one. She found him in the kitchen at 7 in the evening, which was where he was most often at 7 in the evening. A pattern she had come to know the way you come to know the habits of a space you share with someone, not by cataloguing them, but by absorbing them until they are simply part of the texture of where you live. He was making something that involved a pan, and the particular focused economy of movement she had noticed was how he did everything physical, without waste, without performance. She sat down at the kitchen table, which was where she sat when she wanted to be in the same room as something without being in the middle of it. He looked at her once, briefly, and then back at the pan, which she understood correctly as his version of giving her space to arrive in her own time. She sat for a moment. Then she said, "If you had knocked." He was still. The pan was still. She said, I have been thinking about it all afternoon, and I need to be honest with you about what I arrived at, because I have not been consistently honest with myself about what I knew and when I knew it, and I do not want to do that in the other direction now. He turned off the burner. He turned around. He leaned against the counter with his arms at his sides and looked at her with the full attention she had come to understand was the most complete form of respect he knew how to offer. She held his gaze. I don't know what I would have done, she said. I was 23 and I did not know how to tell the difference between feeling good and being right. And I think if you had knocked, I might have let the moment pass without understanding what it was. And I think you might have let me. And I think we might have ended up here anyway. Only without the 10 years of evidence that we are both still here. She stopped. She let that sit in the air between them. Then she said, or I might have been ready. I cannot know. That is the part that is going to cost me something to live with. Not what you did, but the not knowing what I would have done. I wanted to tell you that, because the not knowing belongs to both of us, and not just to you. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see something happening in his face that she did not have a name for yet, but that she recognized as real. The specific quality of a person receiving something they did not expect to be given and do not yet know how to hold. He said, I have told myself for 10 years that I made the right decision, that I read the situation correctly, that I was sparing you from something. He stopped. I think I was protecting myself, he said, from the possibility that I was wrong about what I read in your laugh on the phone, from the possibility that you would have opened the door and I would have been wrong. She looked at him across the kitchen. She thought about what it cost a person like Callum Vane to say the words, I would have been wrong. A person who built things as proof and moved through the world on the evidence of what he had constructed. She thought about what it cost her to sit in the truth that she did not know her own answer. She thought about the novel on the shelf in the study with the ending that did not resolve, and about the author who had called 6 months later to say the ambiguity was right. And she thought, maybe this is what it looks like when two people are finally in the same sentence after 10 years of being in separate ones. The doorbell rang at 8:47. She knew before Callum answered it. In the specific way, you sometimes know things that have been building toward you long enough that your body registers them before your mind does. Reid was in the hallway, in a coat he had bought in the years she was with him. A coat she recognized the way you recognize the inventory of a life you used to live in. He looked at her, and then at Callum, and then at the space between them in the doorway. And she could see him doing the calculation that she had been too close to see while she was living it. The calculation of what it meant that she was standing in this particular hallway with this particular kind of ease. He had come. She understood. With something he wanted to say. He had come the way people come when they have decided too late that they were wrong about something. Looking for the conversation that might revise the ending, she stepped forward slightly. Not to block him, but to be present. To be the first person he addressed. Reid, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him with the specific clarity of someone standing on the far side of something and able to see the whole shape of it from there. She said, I'm okay. Not as reassurance, as information, as the most complete thing she could offer him, which was the truth that she had arrived somewhere he had told her she could not get to, and she had gotten there. And it was not because of Callum, was not because of being married to a man with reach and influence and a shelf full of books he had read in her direction, was because she had finally asked the right questions of the right people, including herself, and the answers had been against all reasonable expectation, the ones she needed. Reid stood in the hallway for a moment. He looked at her the way you look at something you thought you understood and are now revising. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man accepting a piece of information he did not come looking for. And he said, good. He left. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the door. Callum had not moved. She turned around and looked at him in the hallway of the apartment on the 42nd floor with the Chicago night, assembled beyond every window, and the Merrin novel on the shelf in the study, and a marriage that was 17 days old, and already more real than anything she had spent 6 years trying to make real. She thought about ordinary. She thought about 48 words and the shape of them, and she thought about the word that had been underneath all of them, the one she had spent 17 days revising. She thought ordinary was never the right word. The right word was legible. Reid had never been able to read her. She had never been able to read herself in the mirror of his attention. And here was Callum Vane, who had spent 10 years reading everything she worked on, who had made her coffee correctly before she told him how, who had stood outside her door once and made the wrong decision, and had spent a decade building toward the right one. And she was legible to him in a way she had not known she needed to be until she was. She crossed the hallway. She did not say anything, because she had learned, in the 17 days of living with a man who communicated in the language of what he did rather than what he said, that sometimes the most accurate thing you could offer was to be present without words. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him. He looked at her. And his face had the quality she had first seen on the couch in the rain light. The thing, voluntarily, set down, but settled now, less like release and more like arrival. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the way you touch something you are finally allowing yourself to have. And she said, "You should have knocked." He said, "I know." She said, "Don't make that mistake again." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and was more than one, and he put his hand over hers where it rested against his jaw and held it there. And outside the Chicago night went on being the Chicago night, enormous and indifferent and full of people living in the middle of stories they could not yet see the shape of. And in the hallway of the 42nd floor, 2 people stood at the end of 10 years and the beginning of something that did not have a name yet but was, for the first time, entirely chosen,